The old woman looked at me the way you'd look at something the cat dragged in, and then she said the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me. "Fix my husband's Rolls-Royce, Mr. Okonkwo, and I'll let you marry my daughter."
But Sam knew it wasn't
She said
dead.
it like a queen, tossing a coin to a beggar. Eleanor Ashworth, 73 years
then
old,
he found
standing on the steps
the
of a
one
house that
hidden
had been in her
part
family since before the
changed
Civil War, in a silk blouse that probably cost more than I make in a month, looking down at a 50-something black man in coveralls with grease already worked into the creases of his knuckles. She didn't smile when she said it. It wasn't a joke. It was a test and a cruelty. And,
When the old
though
Rolls
neither of
finally
us knew
started,
it yet,
it brought more
the
than a
beginning
car
of the
back
end
to
of a
life.
silence that had lasted 22 years. I should have turned around and driven back to my shop. I had every reason to, but I didn't, because of the daughter she was talking about. Because I knew exactly who Catherine Ashworth was. And Eleanor had no idea that the man she'd just insulted on her front steps had loved her daughter a lifetime ago, before she'd made sure that ended too. I took the job. And 3 weeks later, deep inside the engine of a car that hadn't run in 7 years, I found the one small part that the best mechanics in Georgia had all missed, and what was hidden with it changed everything for this proud, broken family. And for me. But before I tell you what I found under that engine cover, do me one favor. If you've ever been judged by somebody who decided what you were worth in 3 seconds flat, and then proved them wrong just by doing the work, hit that subscribe button right now. This whole channel is for people like us, the ones who let our hands do the talking while everyone else does the talking with their mouths. Go on, I'll wait. Then, let me tell you about the Ashworths. My name is Sam Okonkwo. I'm 46 years old, and I fix cars that most people have given up on. Not the new ones full of computers, though I can do those when I have to. I mean the old ones. The pre-war Bentleys. The mid-century Rolls-Royces. The big, hand-built American luxury machines from the 50s and 60s that were assembled by craftsmen who are all in the ground now. It's a dying trade. There are maybe a few hundred of us left in this country who can do it properly, and there are fewer every single year, because the men who taught us are dying, and the young people, sensibly, want to work on things that pay. My father taught me, in a one-bay garage in a town you've never heard of, with a dirt lot and a hand-painted sign, and his hands are in everything I know how to do. When I close my eyes over an engine, sometimes I swear they're his hands and not mine. I work alone, mostly, out of a shop on the edge of Savannah, Georgia. Concrete floor, good light, a radio that only gets one station clearly, and the smell of oil and old leather that I've stopped being able to smell because it's just the smell of my life. I've got a son, Daniel. He's 22, just finished college up in Atlanta, a business degree, the first Okonkwo ever to get one. He's a good kid, a better man than I was at his age. We don't talk as much as we used to. I'll get to that, because it turns out to be the center of this whole thing, even though it starts 100 miles away from a Rolls-Royce. His mother, my wife, Grace, died 5 years ago. It wasn't sudden, it was the long kind, the kind that gives you months to say everything and somehow leaves you certain you said nothing right. I won't sit in it with you, but I'll tell you one thing she said to me near the end because I carried it into that carriage house without even knowing I was carrying it. Grace looked at me one afternoon, thin in the hospital bed, clear-eyed the way she got near the end, and she said, "Sam, you can fix anything with a bolt in it, but you let the things that actually matter rust. You'll rebuild a stranger's engine for a month and you won't have one honest conversation with your own son." I told her she was being unfair. She just smiled at me, the way you smile at someone who's going to understand you eventually, just not in time for it to do you both any good. The call from the Ashworth estate came on a Tuesday in October. A lawyer's voice, very smooth, very careful, the kind of voice that bills by the quarter hour. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth had a vehicle in need of restoration. A 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud 3. It had not run in 7 years. Several previous specialists had been unable to return it to service. Mrs. Ashworth had been given my name by a collector I'd done work for in Charleston. Would I be willing to come and assess it? I knew the name Ashworth the way everyone in this part of Georgia knows it. Old money, old house, old family, The kind with a pew that has their name on a little brass plate, and a wing of the hospital, and 3 centuries of opinions about exactly who belongs where and with whom. And I knew the name for one other reason. A private one. One I hadn't said out loud in more than 20 years and didn't intend to start saying now. I told the lawyer I'd come Thursday. The house sat at the end of a long crushed shell drive under live oaks so old their branches had grown down to touch the ground and back up again. Spanish moss hanging off them like gray lace. It was the kind of southern grand that's beautiful and sad in equal measure, a thing that is mostly memory now, kept alive by money and stubbornness. Eleanor Ashworth met me on the front steps. She did not invite me inside. She looked at my truck, and then at my coveralls, and then at my face, and I watched her arrive at a complete and final conclusion about all 3 of them in about the time it takes to pour a glass of water. That's when she said it. The line about her daughter. Fix my husband's Rolls-Royce, and I'll let you marry my daughter. I understood the cruelty of it precisely, because I understood what she was actually saying underneath the words. She was saying, "You are so far beneath this family that the single most absurd, impossible reward I can imagine offering you is to let a man like you near a woman like us." It was meant to put me in my place before I'd taken a single step out of it. And the truly remarkable part, the part she had no idea about, was that she had, by pure blind accident, aimed that joke directly at the oldest wound I had. She didn't recognize me. Of course she didn't. 22 years is a long time. I'd been a leaner, younger, more hopeful man back then, and to a woman like Eleanor Ashworth I had never once been a person worth the effort of remembering in the first place. "I'll take a look at the car, ma'am," I said, keeping my voice as level as a torque wrench. "We can talk about my rate after I know what I'm dealing with." She blinked, just slightly. I don't think she was used to being answered as if the joke hadn't landed. Then she turned and led me around the side of the house, heels clicking on the old brick, and she did not look back to see if I was following. The garage was a converted carriage house, brick and timber, older than anything I'd ever worked in. The Rolls sat in the center of it under a fitted dust cover, and when I drew the cover back I felt the thing I always feel with these old machines, something close to tenderness. People laugh when I say that. Let them. It was a beautiful car, midnight blue, deep as the sky an hour after sunset, with hand-painted coach lines so fine you couldn't have laid them with a machine, and the spirit of ecstasy on the nose with her wings swept back, leaning into a wind that had stopped blowing 7 years ago. Dust had settled on her, and the tires had gone flat and square at the bottom from sitting, and there was that particular stillness an unused machine gets, like a held breath. But she was whole. Cars like this don't die. They wait. That's all this one was doing. Waiting. "My husband loved this car more than he loved most people," Eleanor said from the doorway. I hadn't expected her to follow me in. I glanced back. She was standing just inside the threshold, arms folded, watching the car and not me. "Charles," she said. "He passed 7 years ago this month. The car stopped running within weeks of his death, as if it had decided to go with him. I've had 4 men try to bring it back since, real specialists. 1 from Atlanta, 2 from up the coast, 1 flown in from a marquet club. They all told me the same impossible thing." Her voice tightened. "They told me there was nothing mechanically wrong with it that they could find, and yet it simply would not run, as though the car were being difficult on purpose." She said the last part like it was an insult the car had paid her, and she was passing it along to me to see if I could do any better. I didn't answer right away. I'd learned a long time ago that you don't talk to a worried owner the way you talk to a car. I crouched down and ran my palm along the lower edge of the door, feeling the weight of the steel, the honesty of it. I opened the driver's door. It swung with that heavy, vault-like solidity these old Rolls have, and I sat in the seat, in the cracked old leather that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and a man who'd been dead 7 years, and I put my hands on the wheel, and I just sat there a moment and listened. There was nothing to hear. But my father taught me that you listen first anyway, before you ever pick up a tool, because the car will tell you things if you give it the silence to speak in. 3 weeks, I said finally, climbing out. I'll need the car, the keys, and the run of this carriage house. I don't work with people watching over my shoulder. She named a sum then, a large one, larger than the job was worth, and the way she named it told me everything. She was paying for a show. She fully expected me to fail like the other four, and she was pricing the entertainment of watching one more man be beaten by her dead husband's car. I took the number anyway. I had my own reasons, and they had nothing to do with the money. Now, I have to tell you about Catherine, because without Catherine, none of the rest of this means anything. 22 years ago, I was a young man working the floor at a restoration shop here in Savannah, learning the trade I'd half learned from my father and finishing the education in other men's garages. And Catherine Ashworth used to bring her own car in, a little MG Roadster her father had given her for her 21st birthday, British racing green, a temperamental, beautiful thing that was always needing something. She was 24, I was 24. She was an Ashworth, and I was the mechanic's son with grease under his nails, and by every single rule of how Savannah was built and how Savannah worked, absolutely nothing was supposed to happen between us. But she'd linger. That's how it started. She'd drop the car for a clutch adjustment and then she wouldn't leave. She'd lean on a fender and ask me questions, and not the bored, polite questions rich girls ask to seem gracious. Real ones. How does this work? Why did you do it that way and not the other? What made you love this? And I'd answer her because no one had ever asked me those things like they actually wanted to know, and she'd listen with her whole face. Somewhere in those weeks, her leaning on a fender in the long Georgia afternoons, me pretending the job was taking longer than it was so she'd stay, something happened to both of us that neither of us had planned and neither of us knew how to stop. It lasted one summer. The best summer of my life, and I've had some good ones since with a woman I loved truly, so I don't say that lightly. We were careful, or we thought we were. We met where we thought no one would see. For 3 months, I believed, with the particular stupidity of being 24 and in love, that the way the world was built didn't apply to us. Then, Eleanor Ashworth found out. I never learned exactly what she said to Catherine because Catherine would never repeat it, not even at the end of that summer when she cried, telling me it was over. But I know that Catherine stopped coming to the shop. And then, about a week later, a man came to see me, a lawyer, polished, regretful in the way of men who are paid to be regretful, and it was explained to me in that soft Southern manner that is somehow worse than any shouting, that I was a young man with a future to think about, and that Catherine had a future too, and that the two futures did not intersect and never would, and that a wise man understood the difference between what he wanted and what was possible. There was no threat in it you could have repeated to anyone. That was the genius of how people like the Ashworths did things. A month later, I heard Catherine had been sent to relatives in Virginia. I never saw her again. I wrote one letter. I don't know if she ever got it. I married Grace some years later, and I loved Grace with everything I had, and that is not a contradiction. A man's heart is big enough to hold more than one true thing. Anyone who tells you otherwise has only ever loved once. So when Eleanor Ashworth stood on her grand front steps and offered me her daughter as the punchline of a joke, she was offering me, without the faintest idea she was doing it, the exact thing she herself had taken out of my hands a lifetime before. That is why I took the job. Not for the money, which I didn't need badly enough to be insulted for. Not even, really, for Catherine, who I assumed was long married and long gone and a stranger to me now. I took it because the stubborn part of me, the part my father pressed into me along with everything else, wanted to stand inside that family's house and do the one single thing that all of their money and all of their certainty had never been able to buy. I wanted to make the dead man's car sing. I wanted Eleanor Ashworth to stand in that carriage house and hear it run, and know that the man who'd done it was the same one she'd thrown away. The first week, I did exactly what the other four must have done. You start with the obvious. I went through the fuel system, the ignition, the electrical, and the more I looked, the stranger it got, because the car was magnificent. Charles Ashworth had maintained it with real love right up until the month he died. The lines were clean. The wiring was sound, no rot, no rodent damage, the insulation still supple. I pulled the plugs and they were good. I checked compression on all 6 cylinders and it was strong and even, the numbers of an engine with plenty of life left in it. There was spark, there was fuel in the tank, old but not turned to varnish. By every measurement I knew how to take, and I know how to take a great many, that car should have started on the second crank. And it would not so much as cough. This is where the other four had stopped. I understood why. They'd reached the edge of the explainable, called it a mystery, written their invoice for the diagnostic time, and gone home to easier work. There's no shame in it exactly. But my father had a saying, and I heard it in his voice standing in that carriage house at the end of the first week. He used to say, "A car that should run and doesn't is not a mystery, son, it's a message. Somebody is trying to tell you something. Your job is to get quiet enough to hear what." So I got quiet. I stopped trying to make it start. That was the whole trick, though it took me a week to remember it. I stopped attacking the problem and I started listening to the car. I spent 2 full days doing nothing but tracing every system by hand, slowly, the way you'd read a letter from someone you love, following each line from end to end and feeling for the place where the story stopped making sense. And on the 3rd day of that, low and toward the front, my fingers found the first wrong note. The fuel shutoff. On this model, there's a mechanism that governs the flow of fuel to the carburetors, and someone had altered it. Not broken it, altered it. Set it, with care and skill, so that it sat almost but not quite closed, so that fuel would seem to be available and yet never quite arrive. It was the kind of adjustment you would never find by testing components, because no single component was faulty. Every part was in perfect working order. They had simply been told, by a knowing hand, to work against each other. I sat back on my heels and I felt the hair come up on my arms, because here is a thing I know in my bones after 30 years. There is a world of difference between a part that has failed and a part that has been set. A failure is random. It's entropy. It's the universe wearing things down the way it wears everything down. But this was a decision. Someone had reached into this car and quietly, expertly, made certain that it would never run again, and had done it in a way that would read, to any honest mechanic who didn't know the car intimately, as a phantom fault. A ghost. A car being difficult on purpose. And there was exactly one person on this earth who had known this car intimately enough to do that. The man who had died the same month it stopped running. Charles Ashworth had disabled his own beloved car, on purpose, with his own hands, as one of the last things he did. I sat with that for a long while, there on the cold floor of the carriage house, and then I went looking for the why of it. Because a man does not kill the thing he loves most for no reason. A man like that does it as a message, and I'd already been told the car was trying to say something. So I followed the fuel system back, past where any normal repair would ever take you, to a panel beneath the engine that doesn't get opened in ordinary service, a cavity up near the firewall. And it had been opened recently in the life of a 7-year dead car. The fasteners were clean where everything around them was grimed. Someone had been in here last and then closed it, and meant for it to stay closed until the right person came. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a flat metal tin about the size of a hardback book, tucked into a space that had been deliberately cleared to receive it, was a letter. I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because the easy thing, the thing most men would have done, was to carry it straight up to the big house and hand it to Eleanor and collect my thanks. But the tin had a name written across the top of it in fading fountain pen ink, in a careful, old-fashioned hand, and the name was not Eleanor. The name was Catherine. I knelt there in that carriage house with the tin in my 2 greasy hands, and I felt 22 years rearrange themselves around me like furniture being moved in the dark. Because I understood, all at once, what Charles Ashworth had done. He had hidden a letter to his daughter inside the one object on this earth that he knew his family would never throw away, and would never, ever be able to open on their own. He had locked it inside a machine that only a true craftsman could ever reach, because to find it, you would have to love the car enough, and know it well enough, to follow its silence all the way down to this hidden place. And to make absolutely sure that someone would one day have to come and dig this deep, he had reached in and stopped the car from running. The dead car wasn't broken. It was a locked box, and the broken engine was the lock, and the key was a kind of person, not a kind of tool. I did not open the letter. It wasn't mine. I want you to know that. I held a dead man's last words to his daughter in my hands, alone, with no one watching, and I did not open it, because some things are not yours no matter who finds them. But I knew I couldn't give it to Eleanor either, because it wasn't hers. That evening, I found Eleanor in the garden room of the big house, and I asked her, as gently as I could, whether her daughter Catherine was still living. The question startled her badly. I saw it go through her like a current. Her face did something complicated and quickly hid it. "She's in Charleston," she said at last, very stiffly, very upright. "We are not close." A pause that cost her something. "We haven't spoken in some years." "Since Mr. Ashworth passed?" I asked. "Before that," Eleanor said, and she turned to look out the window at the live oaks, and in the set of her shoulders I read the truth of it. That whatever ran through this family was old, that it had been there long before Charles died, that the old man had died inside the crack of it, and that it had never once healed in all the years since. I told her, carefully, that I'd found something inside the car that belonged to Catherine, and that I felt it should go to Catherine directly, from my hand to hers. Eleanor's first instinct was the instinct of a woman who had spent 73 years controlling everything within her reach. She put out her hand for it, palm up, an old habit of command. I didn't give it to her. I stood there in her garden room, and I said, as respectfully as I knew how, that her husband had hidden this where only the Restoration itself could find it, with Catherine's name written on it in his own hand, and that I believed with everything in me that he had meant it to travel to Catherine by exactly this road and no other, and that I was not going to be the man who overruled the last careful plan of a dying man. I was sure she'd fire me on the spot. For a long, cold moment she looked at me with those pale, unbending eyes, and I waited for it. Then something in them cracked, just a hairline, the kind of crack I spend my life finding in metal. And she lowered her hand, and she said very quietly, almost to herself, "Charles always did love that girl more than he loved me. Even at the end, especially at the end." And she gave a small, dry, bitter laugh that had an entire marriage folded up inside it. 50 years of a particular loneliness I had no right to understand, and somehow did anyway. It took me 3 days to find a telephone number for Catherine Ashworth. When I finally got it and dialed it, and a woman's voice answered, and I said, "My name, just my name, this is Sam Okonkwo," there was a silence on the line so long and so total that I genuinely thought she'd hung up. And then, into that silence, she said one word, "Sam." Just that. Just my name, in a voice I hadn't heard in 22 years, said the way a person says a name they have not allowed themselves to say out loud in a very long time. She drove up from Charleston that weekend. I'm not going to pretend the years fell away when she walked into that carriage house, because they don't, and anyone who tells you they do is selling something. We were both different people. She was 46, like me, divorced, a grown son of her own up in Richmond. There were lines at the corners of her eyes I'd never seen the world put there, and gray coming into her hair that she hadn't bothered to fight, and a carefulness in how she held herself that the girl of 24 had never had. But when she came through that door and saw the car, and then saw me standing next to it in my coveralls with grease on my hands, in exactly the posture and exactly the place she'd left me standing 22 years before, she stopped dead, and she put her hand over her mouth and she laughed and cried at the very same time. And I knew, watching her, that whatever had been real between us that summer had not actually died. It had only been doing what the car had been doing. Waiting. I gave her the tin. I told her where I'd found it, and how, and what I'd worked out about why, that her father had disabled his own car, the thing he loved most in the world, to make certain that one day someone would have to dig all the way down to this one hidden place and carry up what was waiting there. She sat down slowly on an old wooden stool by the workbench, the tin in her lap, and I stepped out into the Georgia evening and pulled the carriage house door most of the way closed behind me, and I let her read her father's letter alone. That much I could give her, the privacy of it. It was the least and the most I had. She told me later what it said. Not all of it, some of it was hers and stayed hers as it should, but the heart of it she gave to me. Charles Ashworth had known he was dying when he wrote it. He had known that his wife and his daughter had been torn apart years before by a fight. He blamed himself, to his last breath, for not having had the courage to stop. A fight that had started, Catherine learned this from the letter in her own father's hand, over Catherine's choices, over who she loved and how she intended to live, over a young mechanic, one long ago summer, and everyone and everything that came after him, and Eleanor's iron, unbending certainty about exactly who her daughter was permitted to be. Charles had spent his entire life keeping the peace in that house by saying nothing, by being pleasant and absent and quiet, and he had died knowing that his silence had cost him the two people he loved most. The letter was his apology. It was a dying man telling his daughter in ink the things he had been too much of a coward to say with his voice, that he had been wrong to stay silent, that he had loved her exactly and entirely as she was, that he was sorry, that he was so deeply sorry, and that he prayed whoever finally found this, because someone good would have to make his old car breathe again, would have the decency to carry it to her. And there was one line in it, Catherine told me, that broke her clean in half. Her father had written, "I could not mend what I broke while I was alive. So I have hidden this inside the one thing I trust to outlast me, and I will let a better man's hands carry it the rest of the way." A better man's hands. He'd been dead 7 years before I ever laid a finger on his car. And somehow, across all that time, he'd written a part into his last act for a man he would never meet to come along and play. Now, I told you at the start this isn't a fairy tale, and I meant it. Catherine and Eleanor did not fall weeping into each other's arms and mend 22 years in a single golden afternoon. That is not how real families work, and it is especially not how proud ones work. What actually happened was smaller and harder and far more real than that. Catherine took the letter to her mother. The two of them sat together in that grand, sad, beautiful house, with the dead man's words on the table between them like a third person who had finally decided to tell the truth out loud. I wasn't there. It wasn't my place to be, and I wouldn't have gone if I'd been asked. But Catherine told me afterward that her mother had wept. Eleanor Ashworth, who I would have bet my whole shop had no tears left anywhere in her, and that her mother had said the two words Catherine had waited her entire life to hear and had long ago stopped expecting. "I'm sorry." Just like the letter. Like father, like the wife he'd left behind, both of them arriving at the same two words from opposite ends of a long silence. It did not fix everything. I won't tell you it did. But it started something that had been stopped for a very long time, the way an engine starts. They speak now, Catherine and Eleanor, Sunday telephone calls. It isn't warm exactly. I don't think those two women have warm in them. Not for each other, not after everything. But it's real, and it's honest, and at their ages, real and honest is most of what there is left worth having. And the car. I finished the car. Of course, I finished the car. I undid what Charles had so carefully and lovingly done. I corrected the fuel shutoff he'd set against itself, and then I went through the whole machine properly, the way it deserved, the way he'd have wanted, because by then I felt I half knew the man. And on a cool, bright morning in the second week of November, in that old brick carriage house, with the big doors standing open to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of birds in the live oaks, I sat down in the cracked leather seat, and I turned the key. The 1965 Silver Cloud came back to life after 7 years of silence. It didn't roar. These cars don't roar. It would be beneath them. It came alive with a sound like a long, deep, contented breath. Smooth and low and impossibly dignified, the sound of something built by hand to outlast every single person who would ever touch it. The whole carriage house filled up with it. I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. Eleanor Ashworth was standing in the open doorway. I don't know how long she'd been there. She listened to her dead husband's car running for the first time since the month she buried him, and she put one thin hand flat against the doorframe to steady herself. And for a long, long time she didn't say a single word. Then she walked across that carriage house toward me. Eleanor Ashworth, who'd looked at me like something scraped off a shoe 3 weeks before, and she held out her hand, and when I took it she held on, with a grip stronger than I'd have guessed was in her. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Okonkwo," she said. "Two of them, I believe, though you only know about one." And I understood, in that moment, that somewhere across those 3 weeks she had remembered. The summer. The young mechanic with grease under his nails. My name. She knew exactly who I was, and had known for some days, and the knowing had done something to her that all her certainty had never let anything do before. "You loved my daughter," she said. It was not a question. "A long time ago," I said, and I ended it. She nodded slowly, looking not at me now but at the car, at the breathing, impossible, resurrected car. I spent my whole life perfectly certain that I knew what was beneath this family and what was above it, and my husband hid the truest words he ever wrote in the one place he knew only a man I'd called beneath us would ever be able to reach. He trusted your hands. Her voice caught just slightly and she mastered it. More than he trusted his own blood. More than he trusted me. She let go of my hand. He was right to. I did not marry her daughter. I want to be very clear about that because the way this story began was a cruel old woman's cruel joke, and I will not turn it into a tidy little romance to make you feel good. Catherine and I are something. I don't have a clean word for what. We had dinner the week after the car ran. We've had several dinners since. At 46, with grown children and buried marriages and 22 lost years standing in the road between you, you do not rush, and you do not owe anybody, least of all an audience, a fairy tale ending. We are letting it be exactly and honestly whatever it turns out to be, no more and no less. And I have found at my age that that is enough, that it might even be the whole point. But here is the part that actually changed me, and it isn't the part you'd think. I drove home from the Ashworth estate the afternoon I finished that car, with the sound of it still running somewhere behind my ribs, and I thought about Charles Ashworth. A man who'd kept the peace his whole life by staying quiet, and who'd died regretting every single word he never said, and who'd been reduced, in the end, to hiding his love and his apology inside a machine, and praying a stranger would deliver them after he was gone, because he had run clean out of time to deliver them himself. And then I thought about my Grace, in a hospital bed, telling me I'd rebuild a stranger's engine for a month and not have one honest conversation with my own son. I called Daniel that night, my boy, 22, up in Atlanta, who I loved and barely spoke to, because somewhere in the long months after his mother died I had gone quiet, the exact same way Charles Ashworth went quiet, and had buried myself in other people's broken machines so I wouldn't have to sit in the silence of my own broken house. I called him, and when he picked up he sounded alarmed, asking right away if everything was all right, because his father calling at night for no reason was not a thing that happened anymore. And I said the things I should have said 5 years before. I told him I was sorry. I told him I knew I'd vanished into the work after his mom died, and that I'd left him alone inside his own grief because I had no idea how to be inside mine. I told him I was proud of him, proud in a way I had been feeling for years, and had never once managed to push out through my mouth. There was a long silence on the line. And then my son, my grown son, said in a voice that wasn't quite steady, "I've been waiting a long time to hear that, Dad." We talked for 2 hours, the first honest 2 hours we'd had in 5 years. He's coming down next month. We're going to work on a car together, an old one, a cheap one, just the two of us, just because. Because that is the thing I learned inside a dead man's Rolls-Royce. Charles Ashworth had to hide his apology inside an engine because he ran out of time to say it with his own mouth. He had to trust a stranger's hands to carry what his own heart never could. But I wasn't out of time. I was still here. My son was one phone call away. Not a letter sealed in a tin behind a firewall, not a message that needed a craftsman and 7 years and a small miracle to deliver. One phone call. And I'd been treating it like it was the hardest repair in the world, when the truth is I'd just been too proud and too scared to pick up the tool. The hardest things to fix are almost never the ones under the hood. They're the ones we drive past every single day because we've quietly decided they're too far gone, or too late, or not our place to touch. And we are almost always wrong about that. They are not too far gone. It is not too late. not while the other person is still here and still has a phone and is still somewhere on the other end of a silence waiting to hear from us. I make a decent living. I'll never be rich. There's a version of my life where I stayed bitter about one summer an old woman took from me 22 years ago and let it harden me the rest of the way through. And there's no version of my life where I stay that bitter man and also get to sit across a workbench from my son, handing him wrenches, hearing him laugh, building something with him that neither of us needs except that we both do. I pick the phone call. I'd pick it every single time. So, let me ask you just one thing before you go. Charles Ashworth waited until he was gone to say the thing that mattered most, and had to trust a stranger to carry it the rest of the way. Most of us are luckier than he was. We've still got time, and the person we need to reach still has a phone in their pocket right now. So, here's what I honestly want to know from you. Is there a call you've been putting off? An apology, or an "I'm proud of you," or an "I'm sorry" to somebody who is still here to hear it? And if there is, what is actually stopping you from making it tonight? Tell me in the comments. I read them, everyone, and I'd truly like to know. And if this story reached something in you, if you believe, like I've come to, that the hardest and most important repairs we ever make are the ones with the people we love and not the machines, then do me that one favor. Hit subscribe if you haven't yet. Leave a like so the next person finds their way here. Drop your story down in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Trust me, it's a good one.